Hello, my name is Professor Alex Magadow, and I'm going to talk about how we learn languages as we start the process of learning a new language. Language use is a skill rather than a body of knowledge. Skills, in the way that I'm talking about them, are things that require sort of a mind-body connection that generally take place more or less in real time. They're acquired through practice, and they usually involve figuring things out. You'll often notice that they aren't very linear. You sometimes have a good day, you sometimes have a bad day. Knowledge, on the other hand, is less speed intensive. It's less important that you be able to access that knowledge very, very quickly. You acquire knowledge through a learning process, reading a book about something, watching a video about something, more than you do from simply applying it. It tends to be a deductive process where you're told that here's how something works, now apply it to these other things. And it tends to be linear. What you know today, you'll generally know tomorrow. I remember plenty of stuff I learned in high school, and that was years and years ago, but it still sticks with me, though a lot of skills that I had from a long time ago aren't as good as they once were. So to give you a clearer example of this, think about sports, and this kind of applies to any sport, versus something like learning about and learning calculus at university. In a sport, you have to act in real time. Even a moment's hesitation can mess things up. You're swinging for the ball and you swing half an instant too late. It's gone, it's past, you just had a strike, right? Whereas in something like calculus, these subjects that we're more used to studying in school, you have a longer period of time to think about a problem, even if it's a test, even if it's a timed test. We're still talking about a scale of seconds, sometimes minutes, sometimes an hour to think about one problem, an entire semester to think about a paper, right? And you have all that time to do that and to solve the problem, to do what's required in that time. Whereas in sports and language, you need seconds. If someone says, "Hi, how are you?" and you sit there thinking, "Hi, how are you?" you're going to need to make some sense of what they're asking you before they walk away, right? Same thing with sports. You can't just sit there thinking about how to throw a football and somebody's running towards the end zone. Sports are acquired through intense practices. There's dozens of hours on and off the field in order to get good at them. It really requires a lot of work to make these skills automatic and to link the mind and the body so that you can think, throw football, and do throw football to the right place without having to think about crosswinds and this and that. You just do it. Sometimes a conceptual understanding will help. Your coach might tell you, "Follow through," whatever that means. I've never understood that particular phrase, but they always yell it at you, right? But even if you understand it, you still have to practice it a lot. Calculus and things like that, learning about history, etc., it's acquired through a learning process. You read about it, you might watch a video, you'll practice on some problems. The overall time commitment compared to something like a sport is fairly low, right? One easily spends hours and hours in the gym, for example. One doesn't necessarily have to spend tons of time on a history class in the same way. The conceptual understanding is really the hardest part. If you understand the concept, if you've remembered the material pretty well, it's really not that hard. You don't have to spend hours and hours practicing it in the same way that you do with a skill. The learning process for sports tends to be inductive, right? A lot of things happen to you while you play the sport, and you figure out, oh, that didn't work, oh, that did work, I need to change this. If you get pinned in wrestling, right, you've just learned what doesn't work. Now you need to learn what does work. Whereas in something like calculus or history or whatever, you're given a rule, and you apply that rule. So the rule is ready-made for you. Unless you're Isaac Newton, you have to figure out the first time. The rule is more or less there for you. So it's deductive reasoning. And I've always found with sports and language and playing an instrument, etc., it's not always linear. It doesn't go in a perfectly straight progression from okay to better to truly amazing. There are rocky periods. You might do amazing at one game and just be totally flowing on point, and the next day you stink, and there's no real explanation for it. Though I often find that when you're improving one thing, sometimes other areas suffer as your brain sort of rebuilds this approach to whatever you're doing. On the other hand, knowledge tends to be pretty linear, right? what you know tomorrow, what you learned today, when you go and learn about integrals after learning about derivatives, it generally doesn't disappear in the same way. You aren't suddenly terrible at everything. So when I talk about language learning, what's really important is that we do a lot more inferential learning in language classes than we do deductive learning. And it's really helpful to understand the difference between them. Inferential learning is data-driven. So let's imagine Sherlock Holmes is trying to solve a case, right? In deductive reasoning, deduction, my dear Watson, right? It's very rule-driven. So he sees a set of footprints, right? And Sherlock Holmes does lots of experiments. He talks about how he's been doing these experiments, Watson, and he knows that if you walk backwards in the mud, it leaves a deeper footprint at the heel of the shoe than at the front of the shoe. So when he sees an example of this out in the wild, when he's trying to solve a case, he can apply this rule that he knows. He can deduce that somebody walked backwards and was trying to throw him off the scent. On the other hand, inferential learning is data-driven. So Sherlock Holmes might have 10 different clues, all pointing in different ways, but by synthesizing that information, by inferring what caused those clues to exist, he can figure out who did the murder. So inferential learning is data-driven. Deductive learning, you get a rule and you apply it. For example, if we have 1, 2, 4, you wonder what number comes next. Maybe 6, which would be a little bit weird, because how do we get from 1 to 2 if we're adding 2? Maybe 8. Maybe you're multiplying by 2. Maybe 16. There are other possibilities as well. Maybe it's 7, for example, if you some sort of Fibonacci-like thing going on. What you have to do, though, is you have to build a hypothesis, and the only way to confirm your hypothesis or to disprove your hypothesis is more data. Whereas in a deductive situation, you're given the rule, multiply the next number by 2, the answer is very easy to know, it's 8, right? So you're applying these rules. In language learning, we're going to be doing a lot more inferential learning than we are deductive learning. There's a phrase in Arabic, and it's Allah tigi fi aino. God may strike him in the eye. Supposedly this guy is about to throw a spear at an oncoming army, and he has no idea what he's doing, so he just grabs the spear, he picks it up, and he just hurls it. He says, God, let it hit him in the eye. That's what I feel about the word guess. We're often told to guess. Oh, just guess. I don't want you to guess. In this class, we hypothesize. We make hypotheses, that is, plural hypotheses. You can't just say, oh, maybe it's like this. Think, is it like this? Is it like that? Come up with multiple different hypotheses as you try to understand something. Think about what would support or disprove the hypothesis, all right? So this feels very much like grade school chemistry class, but it's the best way to approach this. If all you do is look at something and you go, I don't understand it, I don't know what it means. Well, surely you have some hypotheses. Start to make those hypotheses. Give yourself a chance to think about, okay, what could it mean? How would I prove or disprove that? You might not have data to prove or disprove it, but we're going to learn ways to check. And a big part of the language learning process is expanding our number of ways that we can check these things. Now, a little aside for those of you who, like me, are very type A. Now, in the book that we're using, we will get a lot of inferential learning. That is to say, the book will give you a video, and you'll see a word or a structure, a verb tense, for example, that you've never seen before. And it will be very frustrating because you're like, why can't they just explain this to me? I want to understand it. If they explain it to me, I'll understand it, and then I can just move on. Well, there's a very good reason for this. First of all, it sticks better. Believe me, I have been learning this language for 16 years, and when someone just explains the rule to me, it's useless. I might as well just go to sleep while they say these things at me. It goes in one ear and out the other. But if I see a rule or see a structure several times, and I start to guess what it means, and I start to think about it, and I've built up 1 or 2 hypotheses about how the structure works, and I get to the chapter where they explain the grammatical structure, it's not acting as an explanation, it's acting as a confirmation of what I pretty much already knew. And that's when it really sticks, and that's when it fills out the little details that I wasn't sure about and made me a little awkward in how I used it. But it clarifies and confirms my hypothesis rather than just teaching me the rule. And it really will be retained better this way, and it's really important when you're learning dozens of vocabulary words, several different grammar rules. You want things to stick as easily as possible. So, another aspect of it is that you're not just learning the language when you take a language class. You're learning how to learn. And learning how to learn a language is one of the most difficult things you can do because there's so much going on. But anyone who's already studied a language intensively knows a lot of skills for learning new languages. And people who speak 6 or 7 languages, after they've learned 2 or 3, it gets a lot easier because they've learned all those strategies. And inferential learning is a really big part of that. So, in my opinion, sit back, enjoy the ride, hypothesize like a mofo, don't get frustrated, let things sort of wash over you. A quick overview of the language learning process, and this is a very simple, simplified view of it, but it's sort of the basics. When you're learning a language, you're going to get input. That's all the language that you hear. It needs to make sense, or else it isn't very helpful. If someone hands you a PhD dissertation in Russian, and you're in first semester Russian, it's not going to be much help except for maybe recognizing the letters and maybe a word or two here and there, the word the, right? You need it to be understandable. At the same time, you need as much as you possibly can get. Then, once you get this input, your brain starts processing it, consciously and unconsciously. And this is where we're really starting to hypothesize about the meaning. If someone says something to you, you hypothesize, this means hello, all right? And then you get to, you're going to say something in return, but your first thing is hypothesizing, oh, what does that mean? I think it means hello because someone told me that means hello. Or, that's the first thing they said to me, etc., right? And this processing step builds up what we call the interlanguage. It's your brain's model of how the language you're learning works. And we have one of these for our native languages too, where we have a model of how the language works. It's a little bit different than other people's models, potentially. Finally, you have this model in your head built up from the input that's been processed by your brain. And then you can output. You can produce the language. And this is where you get to practice the language and where it reinforces and builds up that skill. Like I was saying, we have to practice a skill to be any good at it. And it's also a chance to check for mistakes. So, talking about input. Input is all exposure to the language. I'm talking words, written things, any kind of language whatsoever. All that is input. And this isn't just language, chunks of language like the word hello, right? It can be the gesture, right? Someone raises their hand and waves and says hello, right? Someone tells you to stop, right? In English, we put out the palm of our hand. In Arabic, we pinch our fingers together. It's different gestures. Even the facial expression of how somebody says a sound can change how we understand things. So you'll be watching a video about what's called the McGurk effect, which is where the shape of the lips will change how you understand what sound is being said. And remember that it's often how is as important as what. So something might be said nicely, it might be said often, rarely. For example, in Arabic, it's very polite to say hello, how are you, hi, how's it going, what's up, man, a million times. Saying hello can take 10 minutes. In other languages, if you say good morning to somebody more than once, they start to wonder if you're a bit of a weirdo. With regards to input, the more you get, the better you'll learn the language. This is why people go abroad, right? They're in a place where they're going to get a lot of linguistic input, and they make a lot of progress very quickly because they get lots of language all the time. Of course, it needs to make sense, right? If you can't understand any of it, you're not going to be able to make any hypothesis because it's just gibberish, right? If I play you a recording from some obscure language that no one's ever heard before, you're not going to be able to make much sense out of it. Of course, the teacher's job is to find as much input as possible that's accessible to you, and that's why we write textbooks, etc. And we spend hours scouring the internet to find fun videos and stuff that you can understand, but also are very educational. Now, the sources of input that you're going to have easy access to in this class, the textbook and parts of homework, especially videos, especially readings, these are incredibly important sources of input. Pay attention to them, right? Don't skip the video part of the homework, come to class figuring, oh, we'll watch it again. Even if we do watch it 10 times in class, there's no substitute for being in a calm, quiet place with headphones on your ears, playing the same part you don't understand 10 times over. Every time you play that, your brain, consciously and unconsciously, makes more sense out of the language, so do it. All right? We're going to get input from the classroom interaction, from talking with our peers. And we can get input from anywhere and everywhere. We live in a magical era. When I was studying Arabic, if I wanted to watch a music video from the Arabic-speaking world, it was nearly impossible. I would have had to go to some cafe that had a satellite television and sit there until the video came on that I wanted to watch. Now you can go to YouTube and watch 100 videos for free from all over the world, from your bedroom. You don't need to go anywhere. It's amazing. The secret is to pay attention and to seek these things out. Look at the homework schedule. Maybe we've just learned the first 5 letters of the Arabic alphabet. Those letters are going to be on that homework schedule. You can find them. You can see what they look like in a printed font, right? You can get as much input as you want. It's not cheating to go out and find people using the language and get more input, right? Watch music videos. Some of the best students are the ones who are so invested in the language that they go out and listen to music that they might not understand. I listen to music all the time, and every time I listen to a song, I sometimes understand words that I didn't get before. So get as much input as you possibly can, and especially the stuff in the classroom, but even outside the classroom. Processing. So I talk about interlanguage. This is your brain's personal model of the language. So you have a view of how the language works. It might not be a very small model, right, when you've only learned 5 words and a few letters. But as you learn more and more about the language, your brain starts to form it into this giant amorphous ball of knowledge. And this is true of your first language. Your idea of what the language is might not be the same as one of your friends, right? For example, you might say something to your friend's like, "What? That's not what that means." And you're like, "Well, I thought it did." Your model of the language is different from your friends, and the only way to know who's right is maybe go to the dictionary or ask another friend, right? When we process input, it allows us to make hypotheses and build up our interlanguage. Oftentimes this is unconscious. Humans are amazing statistical learning machines, even when we're adults. We are really good at noticing trends. That is what makes us amazing learners. And as we get more data, we update our statistical model of the language and the world to accommodate that data. Now, of course, this can be supplemented with conscious learning also, right? You can read a grammatical explanation from the book and it makes you understand things better. But at the same time, you also have a lot of background that we're applying. You know, languages have to work in certain ways, right? Words are made up of sounds. You have to be able to talk about objects in the world, which are like nouns, right? You have to talk about things that happen in the world, which are often verbs. Verbs sometimes have tenses, that things happen in the past, in the present, or the future, whatever. And that background knowledge will be very helpful because you have some way to make sense of the language, but it can be deceptive too. So don't forget that languages don't always work the same way. In Arabic, we don't have a verb to own that anyone uses on a regular basis. To have, right? I have a car. No, in Arabic, you'd say the car is with me, or something equivalent to that, right? And we say something similar in English, but it's sort of a marginal structure. We don't use it very often. But we have to start to understand that in Arabic, possession isn't expressed as a verb, it's expressed as a kind of preposition-like thing. And so sometimes our background knowledge can be a little deceptive. But as we process the input, we start to make more and more sense of things and build up our interlanguage model of the language. Now, of course, if we have this great model of how the language works, it's not all that helpful unless we have some way to practice it and make it automatic, right? And this can come down to the very basic things, like there are sounds in the language that we don't have in our native language, and we have to practice the very physical movement of moving your tongue that way in order to be able to perform that function. Even if we understand that that's how it's supposed to be, we still have to practice it. And we have to practice making things automatic. So someone says hello, you have to be able to say hello back quickly, or else they're not going to talk to you anymore. The purpose of language, of course, is to communicate in a meaningful way, to communicate information, to communicate how you feel about somebody, right? Hello doesn't communicate a lot of information, but it communicates that you're friendly and a nice person. You can also communicate that you're not friendly, right? Someone comes up to you while you're studying, they start chatting with you, and you're like, hi, right? You can shut it down, but you're communicating in a meaningful way. And so that's why most of what we use the language for in class is to communicate in a meaningful way. Meaningful drills are the core of our practice, where we're trying to communicate with each other. All right? So if you shortcut that by using English to explain something, you're not going to be getting the same value out of that drill that you would be getting if you stuck with Arabic and tried to communicate, right? And a big part of this is that we need to check to make sure our interlanguage is right, and it matches everyone else's, right? It's one way to make sure that we're correct. If you had a take-home test and had a very lax teacher who let you compare answers, right? If you compared your answers with each other, it's more likely to be accurate. Think of practicing the language as your chance to compare answers with each other, because you're starting to understand how it works, right? If you're working on your homework, you can check with each other, right? Obviously, you can't do that on a test. So where do we practice? Where do we practice the language? We practice it in homework, which is a vital part of this class. Just that physical practice, right? When we're learning an alphabet, we're going to be practicing each letter 10 times, because you need that physical practice in order to be able to do that quickly, right? If you want to write an essay that's 100 words long and you're writing each letter, taking a minute to do it, it's going to take forever, right? We practice in class. We practice talking with each other. We practice playing games. Even when you take a test, you're practicing the language, right? And this is why it's vital to take every opportunity to practice that you can. Just because somebody says, one of your buddies starts speaking with you in English or something, don't let them, right? If there's a time to practice language, keep staying in the language. You're getting the most value out of your time that way. You might be able to practice with your classmates outside of class. You might be able to trash talk someone behind their back in Arabic, which is pretty fun. You might have awesome Arabic-speaking friends who just put up with us, right? I love my Arabic-speaking friends who put up with me and the weird things I try to say and my silly malapropisms, etc., right? Sometimes people are happy to let you practice with them. Finally, I've given you a very simplified view of language learning. There's a lot more to it, right? Your motivation, how and why you're motivated to learn the language is going to change what you want to do and what you don't want to do, right? If you want to talk to your grandma, you're not going to really want to spend a lot of time on essays, but if you want to get an A, you probably ought to. Your conception of your own identity might change how and why you're learning the language, and all these things might change over time. What you want to be able to do with the language, what your goals are. There's so much to language learning. And another thing I didn't talk about a lot here, but which is vital to this class, is cultural knowledge. I just moved to Rhode Island, right? And if somebody said to me, I want a soupy sandwich and a cabinet, I would think that they're completely insane, right? Why would you want a soggy sandwich and a piece of furniture, right? It doesn't make any sense if you're not from around here. I understand all of those words, I understand all of those sounds, I have a PhD, right? I should understand the sentence, but it doesn't make sense if I don't understand Rhode Island culture. Same thing with the word Allahu Akbar, right? If we've only ever seen a bunch of Arnold Schwarzenegger movies where that's what someone yells right before they start shooting their machine gun in all sorts of directions, we might not understand that that's a phrase people say dozens of times a day, usually when they pray, right? It's not, in their minds, it's not associated with violence. It's associated with prayerful relaxation, connection with God, right? If we don't understand the cultural place of this phrase, even if we understand what the words mean, it's not going to help us to communicate. And finally, it sounds like sounds like such a hard process, but remember, language learning is fun, it's great, it's incredibly rewarding. You get to talk to people you'd never be able to speak to otherwise, people who only speak Arabic, and you can understand their views, you can debate with them about different topics, you can expand your own sense of the world, right? You can watch TV, you can listen to songs, you can read books. There's tons of great books that aren't translated into English from Arabic. In fact, one of my favorite things is learning jokes in Arabic, because there's nothing funnier than when someone says a joke in another language and you can get it, you can laugh at it. It's not just a bunch of words, right? It's a punchline that takes 1 second to deliver and you get it and it makes you laugh. You learn more about yourself, your own culture through the eyes of others, and you travel the world, you can see amazing things. And I always like to give a shout out for the fact that you get to meet people in these small language classes. My best friends from college are the friends I had in my language classes, because there were only 10 of us, 5 of us sometimes, in these small classes, and we really got to know each other. We'd practice with each other outside of class and do our homework together. So there's a lot of incredibly rewarding parts of language learning, even if it's a complex process. Finally, just to summarize, language is a skill, not a body of knowledge. You have to practice. You have to make it automatic. You can't sit there and think about things for hours in the same way as you can with certain other kinds of knowledge. It's about making inferences, right? We're going to get a lot of data. We're not going to get a lot of rules thrown at us. And while we're doing that, we need to hypothesize, not guess, not just go, maybe it means this. Think about what it might mean. In the learning process, we need input, so take advantage of all the input you get. Processing will be both conscious and unconscious, but you have to allow that to happen. You have to feed that processing with input. Then you need to bring it out. You need to make it into a skill. So you have to practice it by coming to class, by doing your homework, by writing essays, etc. And by doing skits. Whatever. You need to practice it. And remember, it's all worth it. Language learning is complex, but it is amazing.